as well, so the story fluctuates between the two. Hannah also really wants to make a difference in the village, and should bring the modern world to traditional Eberfield, but there's a lot of resistance. It's very traditional and conservative, so that's a real struggle for her as well. And then sort of tensions rise in the village because men are threatened, they're fearful of losing their power when women start to speak up about what they want through this suffrage society. And so when power is threatened, there's this dark underbelly of what's hidden behind closed doors. And that's something we all know about right through the years. I mean, what's hidden behind closed doors. And so there's these dark and closely guarded secrets, and so the tension builds through the story, and it escalates so that there's a showdown between those fighting for the rights of women and those who want to silence women, and that sort of reverberates through the village and all the way to the House of Commons in London. So that's pretty well where the story heads. Yeah,
it's utterly fascinating. I really loved Hannah. I mean, her character was so nuanced and so richly drawn out, richly fleshed out, I guess I could say. So I wondered, how did you go about creating Hannah's character? What kind of research did you have to do to try and imagine not only her life, but the kind of challenges a woman like her faced at that time?
That was the challenging part. I suppose I knew that she was a teacher, so I started with that sort of research. Researching the world of the Victorian era was a big job, but what I did discover that there was lots of amazing change at that time, lots of progressive thought. There was egalitarianism, there was advances in science, and they understood then that bacteria and pathogens cause disease. So there was this scientific, logical process that started to develop, and there's secularism as well, so the division between science and religion. So she would have been open to all of these kind of thought processes and advanced ways of thinking while she was at university. She would have listened to rallies by the Suffrage Society. They would have come and spoken about women's rights and how to make a difference to women's and children's lives. So the Fabian Society was another big society at the time, and they talked about equal rights for everyone, and about socialism and trade unionism, and the cooperative movement. And that might have really resonated with her, coming from Hartlepool, where she came from a working class background, where people really had to fight for what they needed and what they wanted. So I think she's come to the village ready to go. And there's this tiny agricultural village. It was based, this village was based on the actual village that my father-in-law's family came from. And so it was basically surrounded by coalfields at this time. And it was the last kind of agricultural area in the northeastern Durham, because they couldn't access the coal at that time until later in the 20th century. So it really was kind of frozen in time. So it wasn't too hard then to imagine what those attitudes might have been like. A little bit more research, and I discovered that coverture was a really big thing. It was a medieval legal term and law that went right through to the 19th century, where women were basically bound to their husbands at marriage, in marriage. So once they were married, their rights went to their husbands, who, basically looked after their rights. A woman was not independent any longer. So with this in the background, that really gave me some sort of thought as to how Hannah would think and feel. There was back in the 60s, 70s, the angel of the house became a very popular term for women. These were the women that were, domestic. They lived just a domestic life, looked after the children and the home and the husband, and did not have a life outside of that, really. And then by the 1890s, when Hannah gets to Eberfield, and she's probably this as well, you've got the new woman. So they're a lot more educated by this time, because education has been mandatory through Britain for the last sort of 20 or so years. So everyone can read now. So women are a lot more educated. they want to do a lot more activities. So they're bike riding and playing tennis and doing their leisure activities. There's more time for leisure activities. There's this progressive thought, and they want to make more of a difference in the world. So there was a real struggle between the angel of the house and the new woman.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. So I wondered then, did you always want to write about the suffrage movement, or was this something that purely came out of your research?
Yeah, well, I've always been intrigued by it, I have to say, but I didn't necessarily pick the suffrage movement at the beginning of my story. I was actually probably more going to go down the route of the public health and the changes that happened there. But then I did a bit more research and knew that Eleanor was a teacher, but then that a lot of the early suffrage suffrage societies and the movement were actually teachers. They were heavily involved. And so I thought, well, that's really fascinating. I wonder whether Eleanor was involved in this too. Followed that story a little bit further, that research, and discovered that in fact in 1893 New Zealand legislated so that they had the vote for women, and South Australia, which was still a colony at the time, in 1894, but Britain was nowhere near legislating for the vote for women. And I thought, how can this possibly be? I want to know more about this story. So I mean, we all know about the suffragettes and the Pankhursts. They're kind of a little bit later in the early 1900s. But I didn't know much about this early suffrage movement and why it had taken so long to get to the vote. So I really became really intrigued and decided to weave both of the stories together.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. I have to confess that I found this aspect of the book really fascinating. The gaining of groundswell of opinion and desire for change, the women who took up the fight, the obvious and insidious opposition to giving women a say in their own lives, the setbacks and continued courage of the women who led the way. I guess I just wanted to say, I think it's really hard for us to imagine how difficult life was for women at the time, but I think you've done an incredible job of showcasing this from different perspectives. So how easy or hard was it for you to flesh out the different characters in this book, and was there anything in particular that helped you with this?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, I think I learnt a lot about Millicent Fawcett, who was a towering figure of the suffrage movement at the time. I'd never heard of her before, because everyone knows the suffragettes and the Pankhursts. But when I learnt that she'd been a leader of the movement for 50 years and looked at parliamentary progress and process, I thought, well, she was a really good person to explore and base. I suppose Hannah, she is Hannah's mentor, so I suppose that's helped flesh Hannah's character out in the story as well. Her best friends are Clementine and Esther, and Clementine is a teacher who's almost to the point of being a bit militant already at the start. She's right into it. She's black and white, and I loved writing about her. And that was quite easy to write her character when you looked at the research of the new women at the time. A lot of women would have been quite like Clementine. Esther was a lot more interesting to write about because she comes from like a landed aristocracy background. She's very timid. There are a lot more social expectations around her. She's not allowed to do what she loves. But I really loved exploring the changes to technology at the time and engineering, and it was a lot of women were actually really into the science and engineering fields at the time, and there were women like Heifer Ayrton and Catherine Parsons. They were leading engineers of their day, even though they didn't get all the credit, of course. So I was able to use their character or their personalities and their stories to help flesh out someone like Esther's character, who then becomes really, loves technology and becomes an inventor and follows her passion and dreams as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So the other interesting thing about the suffragists were that they weren't only concerned about giving women the vote, were they?
No, they weren't. As I said, they were teachers to start with, a lot of them, and so then primary focus would have been education for the children. So they were quite instrumental in improving the Education Acts and creating equal education for boys and girls. At the time, children or girls were still doing needlework and nowhere near as many science-based subjects as the boys. So they were very involved in doing that and getting higher education for children equally as well. And at that time there were very, very few high schools for girls. In fact, they couldn't progress in their education. And then of course universities as well. Girls could go to some universities through the different colleges, the women's colleges attached to the universities, and maybe even do some of the same courses as the boys or the men, but they weren't awarded degrees. So that was something else that they were really lobbied towards. And in fact, London University was the first university to grant degrees to women, and Durham University in the mid-1890s as well.
Wow.
So yeah, that was really interesting to explore. But not only that, there were all the changes and reforms to a married woman, to her property. She wasn't actually in legal possession of her possessions, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah.
So her personal belongings, her income, she wasn't allowed to own property or inherit property as well, before the laws were amended and changed. And this did improve so that women could own their own property over time. And in fact, in 1882, married women were actually given back their rights from when they were single women.
Yeah.
So there was that, and then lots of other things to do with women being able to get equal access to divorce, legal separation, custody of their children, because men had custody of the children. And maintenance and all of those sorts of things. So they were involved in a lot of other things as well.
Yeah. Now I remember when we recorded the podcast that you told me a really interesting story about Millicent Fawcett and losing her purse.
Yeah.
Perhaps you'd like to tell the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So she got really involved in improving the Property Acts. Apparently one day she was out in the city and someone stole her purse. Anyway, the purse was recovered and brought back and given to her husband because it was his property. Yep, the purse and the money in it, all of it was his property. They didn't give it back to her, and that made her think, what is going on here? We have to change this. This is not right.
Absolutely. Very telling. Thinking about how far women have come from Hannah's time, before women were allowed the vote, to now, some of the things that you wrote about struck me as still being relevant today. We still live in a predominantly patriarchal society. So what do you hope that readers will take away from this story?
Yeah, well, we really do still live in a patriarchal society, and I think we're still on the journey to gaining equal rights to men in all fields. But I think this is a really universal issue. Women right through time, as far as I can see from the stories that I've written, and I'm assuming it's everywhere, women have always lived in societies where they've been disempowered or disadvantaged. And they've always had the same sort of challenges with the patriarchy that women have right through time. And I think even still today to some extent. So, there is that. What was the next part of the question?
I just said, I wanted to know if you, what you wanted readers to take away from the story.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I think what's inspired me is, and maybe would inspire you too, is the fact that women have had to live with these difficulties and challenges and still find hope and love and joy in their lives, and live authentic, fulfilled lives as well. In my story, women are courageous because they fight for women's rights, but they're not only courageous because of that, they're courageous because they have to live normal lives with the restrictions imposed on them anyway, and work out what can be changed, what can't be changed, and how to be flexible in the direction and keep that dream alive that they have to want to make a difference to other people. So I loved that about it, and I think the other thing that I'd like readers to take away is that it's not all just about hardship. It's about that beautiful collective of women, the sisterhood, the collective sisterhood, and women getting together and sharing their stories and their difficulties, and finding ways to solve their problems. And these relationships between women, family members, friendships, they were really meaningful and gave great support and nourishment to each other. And I think when women are together, they can find solutions to problems, and there's a lot more power in telling their stories and finding a way forward. And I think that's something I'd like people to take away as well, that the fact that there is that light and that dark, and hope and joy and light does rise to the surface.
Certainly does. When we meet Hannah at the beginning of this book, she was adamant that she was not going to get married.
Yep.
And her dreams of taking up the suffragette cause and remaining unmarried are highly challenged in this book. Can you talk more about this and how your research informed Hannah's character?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I used Millicent Fawcett. She was a great role model for Hannah, but also the new women of the time. You know, they often were unmarried and they lived independent lives, and they followed their cause that they wanted to pursue. So this was the basis of Hannah's character, but of course she's challenged with this. Most working class or middle class women don't have independent means, so they can't afford not to be married. There's a social expectation. Women are expected to marry. There's something wrong if they don't. And then there's the duty to her family and her community. And as a teacher, she has a certain reputation to uphold as well. But we learn along in the story that women who are married can't teach. So, I mean, that's another reason she wants to stay very much unmarried, because teaching is her passion. And, you know, fighting for the women's vote takes up a lot of her time, and she can't dedicate time to a family. Women at this time don't have control over their bodies, about when they fall pregnant, how many children they have, and then the time that it takes to devote to a family. With a husband that's understanding in an equal marriage, you know, those sort of things didn't really happen at that time. So I guess from looking at the whole society at the time, between the new women, the angels of the house, the coverture laws, things were improving and progressing, but not enough. So I mean, that's the real struggle and